Unlike other policies, such as those regarding health, education, or defense, the Common Agricultural Policy, also known as CAP, is one of the European Union's most central policies and aims to ensure that food is high quality, safe, and affordable for the consumer. The three priorities of CAP are viable food production, sustainable management of natural resources, and the balanced development of rural areas throughout the EU. But did you also know that rural areas make up more than 77% of the territory of the EU, with about half of the population? That there are approximately 12 million full-time farmers in the EU, and that the EU's food industry and agriculture sector accounts for 6% of the EU's total GDP and provides jobs for 46 million people, or that CAP currently uses almost 40% of the common budget of the EU, that is more than 50 billion euros per year. But how is this 40% of the EU's common budget used? As income support for farmers and assistance for complying with sustainable agricultural practices, in market support for the stabilization of markets, and via rural development measures. Why do we have to support agriculture? Farmers' investments always depend on economic, health, and weather conditions that are beyond their control, which makes them vulnerable. Supporting farmers' incomes ensures food production throughout the EU and pays for the provision of public benefits which have no market value, for example, environmental protection, animal welfare, or safe and high-quality food, just to name a few. The main benefits of rural development support are the transfer of knowledge and innovation in rural areas, as well as the agricultural and forestry sectors, improving the competitiveness of the agricultural sector, the functioning of the food supply chain, ecosystem preservation, furthering effective resource management, and the economic development of rural areas. We need the Common Agricultural Policy to guarantee that consumers have access to safe, high-quality food at an affordable price. To be more prepared for future crises, we have to pay more attention to risk management in shaping the future of CAP.
Make every exam your moment with CHEK. Keep a steady part.
Today, there are more than 500 million people in Europe. How can we ensure them a stable supply of healthy, safe, and affordable food, now and in the future? The answer lies with our farmers, essential to our economy and our society. There are more than 12 million full-time farmers in the EU and 46 million people involved in farming and the agri-food sectors. But the farming business is at the mercy of economic and weather conditions beyond farmers' control, which is why Europe supports it through its Common Agricultural Policy, or CAP. This provides a safety net for Europe's many different kinds of farmers and farming practices so they can produce enough food. Over time, the policy has changed. Its newest reform makes the CAP greener, fairer, and more efficient. It supports farmers' incomes to ensure that they can continue to produce food throughout the EU and to help them deliver public benefits. It also offers new resources to farmers to strengthen their position in the food supply chain. Europe is known throughout the world for the quality and diversity of its food and culinary traditions. With the CAP, Europe's farmers can ensure an abundant variety of quality European products today, tomorrow, and for future generations. Europe's Common Agricultural Policy, taking care of our roots.
Hi there. In this video, let's talk about food, our most basic need. Access to food is a human right, so we all have the right to feed ourselves with dignity. But the food system is quite complicated, goes through multiple stages before reaching us. Have you ever wondered who is responsible for the food we eat and how we are able to access healthy, sustainable, and affordable food? To understand how food policy works in Europe, you need to know about the Common Agricultural Policy, the CAP. The CAP has been an important implementation and has been funded by the EU budget since its launch in 1962. The policy is centered on three key actions. First, direct income support. Farmers receive direct payments to guarantee their income stability, as well as for actions usually remunerated by the markets, like taking care of the countryside. Secondly, market measures. These complement the direct income support for farmers and include market intervention, a provision of sector-specific support, rules on the marketing of agricultural products such as labeling and standards, and the managing of tariff quotas for international trade. And thirdly, rural development measures. Each member state receives a financial allocation to implement at least one national program. Each EU country and region can decide which measures are best based on their regional needs, under the condition that the chosen program falls in line with EU standards. Ever since its creation, the objective of the CAP has been to maximize production, and this aim has not since been reevaluated. This logic of maximizing agricultural production and inevitable oversaturation of the market has led to an unfair distribution of funding combined with unsustainable practices. Here's how. First, the CAP subsidies are hectare-based payments, which are not dependent on the meeting of criteria such as ecologically friendly, sustainable, and healthy production, or standards for workers' rights and animal welfare. Large farming operations and non-farming landowners have benefited from these sorts of subsidies, while small farmers are unable to compete. Small farmers can no longer make a decent living and have to end their commerce. This has led to a loss of jobs and a decline in economic activities in rural areas, and as a result, fewer people are living in the countryside. Meanwhile, industrialized farms take center stage, bringing little economic value to local communities and only employing small numbers of people. There is also a huge downside to productivity without sustainability. Farmers with less land have to produce more to make a profit. To save money, they resort to importing genetically modified soy or pesticide-treated monocultures from the United States, a pattern that contributes to the land grabbing and destruction of forests and savannas of South America. In order to cut costs and to comply with EU rules, farmers are forced to buy seeds from a handful of powerful agrochemical corporations. Consequently, about 75% of plant genetic diversity has been lost in the past 100 years. Many farmers use chemical fertilizers and pesticides to ensure profitable harvests from these homogeneous seeds, which leads to a loss of food diversity and a reduction in water quality and soil fertility. Chasing productivity also means that surplus products that cannot be sold on the EU market are instead mainly exported to so-called developing countries. Through high subsidies, large industrial agro enterprises can then sell their goods within these countries at way below the market value. These practices destroy local farming and often ruin entire livelihoods for local people. Now that you know the theory behind the Common Agricultural Policy, you can see that it needs quite a few improvements. So what would a better Common Agricultural Policy look like? First, EU funds should be redistributed fairly, and they should reward sustainable land use that is conducive to the public good. This will support smaller, more sustainable farms, which provide quality jobs and have environmentally friendly outputs, which will then lead to creation of local, decentralized food systems, especially in rural areas. A better common agricultural policy will also ensure that the social and labor rights of farmers and farm workers throughout the food chain are respected. Price dumping at the farm level, as well as unfair trading practices, should be stopped. And finally, public funds should ensure that farmers can make a living throughout the transition to sustainable practices. In a nutshell, we need a policy that is coherent with the EU's environmental, climate, and development policies, and one that produces healthy food for all and helps rural communities to thrive. Unfortunately, it's not quite that simple, as these reforms are being opposed by extremely powerful stakeholders: large-scale factory farmers, chemical and export industries, retailers, discounters, and supermarkets are all advocating for maintaining the status quo in order to protect their profits. So hey, it's up to us to hold our policymakers accountable and demand change.
So, hi everyone. So, always check to see who is funding these non-governmental organizations that produce YouTube videos and other items. And this Green European Foundation, it receives grants from the European Commission. So, I always am a little bit suspect about defenses of the Common Agricultural Policy because, as they mentioned at the very beginning of this video, the biggest beneficiary of the subsidies of the Common Agricultural Policy have not been small farmers living on small farms, maintaining the traditional way of life. It's not been them who has been the main beneficiary of the Common Agricultural Policy. It's been these big corporations, these agro-businesses. Of course, I don't really know their names in Western Europe beyond the famous French one, Danone, right? Danone is a huge French agricultural company and food packaging and production company called Danone. And I know about it because when I was in Bulgaria, Bulgarian stores were filled with Danone products from Danone yogurt and other items were flooding into the Bulgarian stores when Bulgaria was preparing to enter the European Union. And so they're going to fight to defend these common agricultural policy subsidies as well. And it's complicated. I'm not saying it's only about corporate profits because Danone is for example, Danone is an international global company. So it's making profits everywhere, not just in Europe. And its production facilities and activities are global. But there are lots of threats that these European farmers face from American and Canadian farmers in particular, also to some extent Australian farmers and other farmers from around the world that produce products more cheaply than European farmers do because of cheaper land in Canada and the United States, concentrated land production already in the United States and Canada. Farms tend to be bigger than they are in Europe. For a lot of reasons, American and North American and Australian farmers, they can produce products more cheaply than European farmers. And so the European Union has been reluctant to open up its agricultural food market within the European Union to imports from outside completely. It's been very willing to protect through tariffs and restrictions the European food production capabilities because they are worried or concerned that if they opened up their imports, their markets to imports from anywhere in the world with no tariff barriers, that Europe's own food production capability would fall because European farmers would go out of business. And then, of course, those European farm lands that go out of business would then be converted into residential or business or whatever kinds of real estate that they would turn into away from farmland. And as Koreans know, for example, once you lose that farmland to development to build houses or roads or airports, you can't go back to making it into farmland once it's been used for other purposes. So and so, of course, that's a concern, for example, in Korea, because Korea has a free trade agreement with the European Union as well as with the United States. But that free trade agreement with the United States that came into effect, almost 10 years ago, it does not fully allow the Americans to access South Korea's rice market because South Korea insists that there must be South Korean rice farmers and rice farming production capability must be allowed to continue to exist in South Korea because who knows, bad things can happen. There can be international conflict. There can be some unforeseen or foreseen crisis could happen and South Korea not have access to adequate food imports. And so they have to have and maintain some degree of South Korean rice production domestically, which has to be protected just in case. And that's the European argument also, that they have to be able to supply Europe with food in case something bad can happen, that they do not want to lose their own food production capability. And I'm trying to imagine what those situations would be. I mean, of course, after World War II, the concern was, of course, war, that, if there was another war, that there would be a disruption to trade, a war, say, between the United States and the Soviet Union. And during World War II, of course, again, that goes back to that point I made earlier at the Friday class. There's this shadow of World War II that looms and hovers over everything. It's an unspoken ghost, an unarticulated ghost that's everywhere in discussions of the European Union that is the back context for these debates. So during World War II, of course, there were food shortages in Britain because the Germans tried to put a naval blockade on Britain to starve Britain into submission. And of course, then during right after World War II, there was disruption in the economy, and there was actual starvation in Europe. People couldn't feed themselves, in Western Europe in the mid to late 1940s, right after the war. And I remember my father, growing up poor in Italy, sharing a 2-bedroom apartment with, like, I think 2 families. How they relied upon cheese given by the United States military. The U.S. Army provided cheese to them to eat, because otherwise they were not going to have enough food to eat in Italy at the end of World War II, after all the devastation, the destruction of the war, and the disruption, that they relied upon American cheese. I guess something like how, for example, South Koreans today have an adoration for Spam, because Spam was the food that was used to supply the U.S. military, and that was pretty much one of the few sources of food available after the Korean War in the 1950s. So during Chuseok, Koreans exchange canned meat, this Spam-type meat, because of this memory of their hardship during and after the Korean War. So, but the point is that, of course, the European Union also would like to export its food production. It would also like to export its food production. But of course, Indian farmers in India want to protect themselves from what they view as unfair competition from Europe, particularly if these European companies are subsidized by the European Union's common agricultural policy. So it's a very complicated topic, right? Even though we know that you have to engage in agricultural reforms and changes like the Chinese have done or other countries have done in order to promote industrialization, the efforts to create a true single market in global agricultural products has always been inhibited or blocked for reasons including national security, but also because of the concerns regarding the economic vested interests in these institutions, in these policies that were created, and then lots of companies and businesses developed their business strategies around these existing policies, and then they lobby to protect them because people want to protect what they have, and they don't want to, open up their imports to Canadian and American farm exporters, because then they created a successful business with the common agricultural policy of the European Union supporting it. Then you change the rules by changing the common agricultural policy. They say it's not fair. They get angry. They get hostile. But there's another reason why the European Union justifies the common agricultural policy. And it's not just because they don't want competition from too much competition from the Americans and the Canadians and the Australians and also South American exports. It's also because they view this moderated, controlled evolution of the agricultural sector in the former communist countries as necessary for peace in Europe. That again, this hovering ghost or spirit, unspoken spirit, this elephant in the room, so to speak, which is again the legacy of the 1930s. The belief was that in the 1930s, one of the biggest sources of support for authoritarian populists and radical populists in Europe, conservative populists in Europe during the 1930s were discontented farmers, discontented peasants, people living in Western Europe whose lives are being disrupted by industrialization, and that they were among the strongest supporters, core group supporters, as they moved into the cities, in particular in Germany and in Italy and elsewhere, for radical authoritarian populist fascists. And that you need a common agricultural policy in order to moderate and oversee and regulate this inevitable transformation in these farming sectors, right? And this happened in Europe, of course, in Western Europe in the 20th century, but now it's going on in Eastern Europe, particularly since the fall of communism. since the fall of communism in 1989. I mean, the standard percentage, the number that was often cited in terms of percentage of the population in countries like Poland or Bulgaria, or that were still dependent upon the countryside as farmers or peasants, was about 30% of the population in Bulgaria, or 30% of the population in Poland were still farmers or living in small towns focused upon farming. 30%, almost a third of the population. Now, I know that's a very rough general statement about, what does it mean to be, dependent upon farming. But the point is that there was much higher percentage of the population in these countries like Bulgaria, Poland, Romania, Hungary, that were still dependent upon farming, even though, of course, they had industrialized to some extent under communism, but still it was close to 1/3 of the population by 1989 were still farmers. What percent of the population in the United States or South Korea today are farmers? It's no more than 4%. I think it's about 3.5%. 3 to 4% of the population in the United States, 3 to 4% of the population in South Korea are engaged in farming. 3 to 4%. Three or four people out of every 100 people in those countries. In Eastern Europe, it was almost 1/3, 33% in 1989. And that has to change. But that's going to cause tremendous social anxiety and disruption as people lose their farms, they go out of business, they can no longer work on the farm because they can't make any money, even though the land has belonged to their family for who knows how many generations. They cannot make money, they go bankrupt, they lose that land, they have to leave the land, they have to go make a new life somewhere else, perhaps typically in a city. And that is a potentially very stressful and dangerous process. And it's inevitable, it has to happen, but it has to be regulated and guided. And you have to make sure that you have political support for this transformation. And the Common Agricultural Policy gives the incentives for these inefficient farming sectors in Hungary and Poland, in Bulgaria, to build up supporters and allies in those sectors, on the rural sectors of those post-communist societies, who will support European integration. So yeah, you're finding lots of rich people are becoming even richer through the Common Agricultural Policy, but they like the Common Agricultural Policy, and they like the European Union, including people who are becoming wealthy in the course of the development and the reform and the change of and consolidation of these East European agricultural sectors in Poland, Bulgaria, Hungary, Czech Republic, and so on, into bigger and bigger plots of land, right? I mean, in the US, a typical farm, I don't know, I'm not a farmer, but like the smallest farms I knew of that I grew up around in my home in Ohio, there were at least 150 acres of land. You go to Poland or you go to Bulgaria, the size of a farm belonging to a Polish peasant 30 years ago or 40 years ago, it was much, much smaller. It was like just basically a big lot of land, not a real farm as we imagine in the United States, right? And so there has to be consolidation. In other words, these small plots of lands have got to be made into big plots of land by adding them together. And that means people have to sell their land. People have to go out of business as farmers. And that's going to be a very stressful process if you're going to end up in a situation where 3 to 4% of Polish people in the future will be involved in farming, down from 1/3 in 1989 when the Berlin Wall came down. So the last time I checked a year or two ago, the word was that now 15% of the Polish population, half of 30, 15% of the Polish population were involved in farming, down from 30%. 30 years after the end of communism, it was down to 15%. But it took 30 years to go from 30% to 15%. And the Common Agricultural Policy has invested lots of money in Polish agriculture. And of course, this process of small, inefficient farms going out of business has been regulated so that it's easier, politically easier and less stressful to do it, right? Typically, often, as you know, that sons and daughters of farmers typically don't want to be farmers, right? They want to, like in South Korea, they want to move to Seoul, they want to move to Busan, and they want to go to college, and they want to get a degree, and they want to make a lot of money, and they want to get a job, and they want to get get a job, make a lot of money, and buy an apartment and live in the city. And you go back to your grandparents or great grandparents' village during Chuseok, right? And go say, oh, it's so great, the countryside. Oh, we love our little homeland village. Oh, yes, our family's home village. Yes, isn't this wonderful? But it's really becomes a vacation home. It's a vacation home. It's a place for your grandparents to live until they pass on. And that's what might happen with my family in Italy, right? My family in Italy, they still have their old family home in their village in Capitignano, but now it's just a vacation home. It's where they go in the summertime when they have their vacation up in the mountains, away from the heat of the summer. And that's what it is. And so that, imagine that process happening in Poland, or Bulgaria, and the Common Agricultural Policy has made that politically feasible without generating intense support for radical populists trying to exploit the otherwise great insecurity, anxiety, and fear, and frustration and anger of people who are farmers going out of business because they can't compete in the new capitalist system. And that, again, the European Union, it does not get enough credit for its successes, because its successes involve avoiding catastrophes, preventing bad things from happening. So when they don't happen, we don't know about them because they didn't happen. So the fact that there has not been a Polish Mussolini, or that there has not been a radical authoritarian populist regime emerge in these countries, that is a success in a sense. Even the Law and Justice Party in Poland today, they're a right of center party. They're no more right wing than the American Republican Party in the United States. They're not going to take Poland out of the European Union. They're not Polish Mussolinis. It's political theater to appeal to Polish nationalism, their efforts. But I doubt very much we're going to see a Polish exit from the European Union, because the Poles reject European values, because those European values include money from the Common Agricultural Policy that spent a lot of money in Poland, in Hungary, and Bulgaria over the last 32 years since communism fell. And they know that. And there are a lot of people in Poland, Hungary, and Bulgaria in the farming sector who have become agricultural oligarchs, agricultural business people, making big companies and big corporations in the agricultural sector, that they just love the European Common Agricultural Policy. And we all know that. But of course, if you have some question about how these subsidies are distributed, because these Common Agricultural Policy subsidies are distributed by the governments themselves, right? The European Union typically gives the money to the Polish government, or the Hungarian government, or the Slovak government, or the Bulgarian government, and the Bulgarian government has to distribute those Common Agricultural Policy subsidies to according to the plan that they submitted to Brussels as to what they're going to do with the Common Agricultural Policy. But it still relies upon the Polish government and the Bulgarian government and the Slovak government and the Czech government and the Hungarian government and the Estonian government to carry out these policies. And it's not surprising that the politicians that rule the government in Estonia or Bulgaria or Poland or Czech Republic or Slovakia, they're going to give those subsidies, or tend to favor those subsidies going to their friends. The people in power will tend to give the subsidies to those groups that support them being in power. And that's part of political reality. We call it patronage. And it's just a fact of reality. And although people who are not from Europe might say that as evidence of corruption, nevertheless, it's probably inevitable. And so, and that's one of the reasons why Viktor Orban of the Hungarian Fidesz party, his support groups and his government have benefited so much from common agricultural policy subsidies, cohesion policy subsidies, all of these benefits from the European Union, that they're not going to take Poland out of the European Union or Hungary out of the European Union the way Britain left the European Union. Because Britain had always been one of the strongest criticizers of the Common Agricultural Policy. Britain did not join the European Union until 1973. The Common Agricultural Policy began in 1962. So it existed for 11 years before Britain was in the European, what was then the European Community. And Britain has always had the most efficient farming sector among the big, powerful countries in Europe. So British farmers are more efficient than French farmers, or in particular. So the British have always been irritated, even under Margaret Thatcher, about the common agricultural policy, because they paid money into the European Union budget. Remember what last week we covered the European Union budget. They paid money in. 40% of that money would go to the common agricultural policy. 40% of the 150 billion euros would go to the common agricultural policy. And most of that money would not come back to Britain. Britain would not get the same proportion of money that it set in for the common agricultural policy as it would receive. I mean, it put in much more money into the common agricultural policy than it received back from common agricultural policy funds, because British farmers are smaller in number and more efficient than French farmers or Greek farmers or Italian farmers. And this was always one of the first sources of anger that Margaret Thatcher, as Prime Minister of Britain, highlighted when she became Prime Minister. She said, "I want my money back." So in 1984, 5 years after she became the Prime Minister of United Kingdom, she demanded and received a rebate, that Britain would receive a rebate from the European Union funds, because it's not fair that, she said, that British taxpayers are paying to subsidize inefficient French and Spanish and Italian and Greek and Portuguese and so on farmers. And they maintained that rebate until Brexit, until Britain left. The European Union was always giving that so-called rebate back to the United Kingdom that Margaret Thatcher negotiated, I think it was in 1984. So the common agricultural policy is particularly controversial, in part because, you know, we all know how much the Earth is under challenge from climate change, how there's more and more climate extremes with droughts and floods that already challenge food production around the world. And the world's population is continuing to grow in size. And we need to encourage India and these poor countries to develop, which means they need to export their cheap agricultural products, because their agricultural products can be very, very cheap because they're a very poor country, and so people's incomes are low and so on. But European farmers don't want to completely open up their farming operations. European businesses don't want to completely open up their agricultural operations to imports from the outside world, even though the other parts of the world, particularly the poorer countries like in Asia and Africa and Latin America, in order to develop and respond to the challenges of poverty and now global climate change, they need money. They need to develop their economies. And so Europe is always under attack for this common agricultural policy. Under Donald Trump, he attacked it, and the Europeans always resist. And the Europeans under Donald Trump resisted because the argument is they need the common agricultural policy to carry out peaceful political, social, and cultural change and economic change, revolutionary change peacefully in these post-former communist countries that are still joining the European Union. I mean, Ukraine would like to join the European Union someday. That's a big country. That's 40 million people. That's the size of Poland. And again, about a third of the population in Ukraine is involved in farming. Or Serbia, a much smaller country, but still big section of the population involved in farming, and they want to join the European Union. And any other country that wants to join, you know, they need to keep the common agricultural policy in order to alleviate and limit the social conflicts within these countries as they undergo these radical changes in their political economy, in their business and economic structures, to become like South Korea and the United States, where again, no more than 3 to 4% of the population in South Korea or the United States are involved in farming. So they don't want to give up the common agricultural policy because they need it, because again, the European Union is a peace strategy. It's ultimately a strategy for peace. And that means you have to orchestrate and regulate and oversee and order this transformation processes in these countries. It's still ongoing. You know, and of course, Turkey wants to join the European Union, but you know, it's probably not going to anytime soon. But Ukraine would like to join. Other countries would like to join, like in the Caucasus countries and so on, despite the opposition of Russia. someday there might be change in Belarus, political change, and we'll see. Maybe a pro-European Union government might come to power in Belarus on the borders with Ukraine, for example, and so on. So they need the common agricultural policy because they have to transform peacefully the agricultural sectors in these former communist countries. That seems to be the primary motivation or use of justification defending the ongoing common agricultural policy in the European Union. So before I forget, let's go to our smart attendance. And so we go to share screen. And I think I had I guess I didn't have that open. Okay, well, let me go back to the smart attendance or cyber campus here. And so I don't know if you can see that. Let me go back to share screen. And your smart attendance number is, let me see here, attendance and smart attendance. So here we are on week 11 and your smart attendance number is 998. 998 is your smart attendance number, 998. So go to chat, type in 998, and there you go. 998 is your smart attendance number. Also, I think you probably all know, or you receive automatically SMS messages when I upload a something on the assignments and materials. So you can see here is your take-home final examination paper, same format as the midterm paper, and that's due November 27, so 19 days from now. It is to what respond to this question: to what degree has the global environment surrounding the European Union's foreign policy ambitions changed in the last decade and a half? What has been the EU's response? So that's taken from the Olson textbook, your textbook for the class. So again, that's the plan. So there's your final exam. So so here are the notes from the Common Agricultural Policy and Environmental Policy. Again, so much is changing so quickly now in the European Union since the pandemic began that, in a sense, of course, the notes regarding the European Union's agricultural and economic environmental policy is changing rapidly. The pace of change has accelerated, sped up in the European Union now that the global climate crisis has intersected with the pandemic response and the need to come up with more accelerated policies to deal with the challenge of global climate change, which the European Union is incorporating in its next generation European Union pandemic recovery program. In the next generation program, the European Union insists that these national economic programs that the European Commission must approve for each country in the European Union has to develop green and sustainable recovery programs to promote sustainable environmentally protective policies that limit greenhouse gas emissions, as well as promote digital and electronic economy. But the emphasis also on moving away from fossil fuels, greenhouse gas emission industries, is part of this next generation pandemic, COVID-19 pandemic response programs that each of the member states is attempting to implement. And in a sense, it does build upon the Common Agricultural Policy institutional framework, and that you saw in that video I was showing that was, from 3.5 years ago, from May 1919, that or 2.5 years ago, that the member states were supposed to submit a national plan to the European Commission regarding their agricultural plans, agricultural development strategy. Now that's been expanded tremendously with the next generation European Union, and the European Commission is playing a more active role in making sure that the policies of the member states conform with the laws of the European Union in that next generation plan. So, for example, even addressing, for example, issues that really don't have anything directly to do with agriculture or sustainable non-fossil fuel green economic projects, demanding, for example, that Poland stop changing its judicial constitutional framework to protect the autonomy and independence of the Polish judiciary, or not get the money from the European Union, or Polish authorities stop adopting anti-gay rights legislation, or they're not going to get the next generation money. That is not emphasized anywhere in your textbook. That is a more recent, interesting, significant development in the European Union. So this is all being discussed on the eve of the pandemic, of course, and agriculture, environment policy have particularly emerged, but environmental policy in particular, because for a number of reasons, including the fact that the European Union, I think, saw a niche, saw a political opportunity to play a global leadership role in world affairs by emphasizing environmental protection and environmental sustainable development. And now with the pandemic, really playing an opportunity, providing an opportunity for Europe to appear to be a world leader in addressing global climate change. So the United Nations Conference of Parties number 26 of the Kyoto Protocol is now meeting in Scotland, in Edinburgh, in Scotland. And this is the second week of the 2-week meeting. And of course, Great Britain, United Kingdom is no longer part of the European Union. But of course, Scotland is, many Scottish people are unhappy about that. So, and then of course, agricultural policy also is part of this. So, I'm an older man, right? So I have seen things since the end of communism, and I've seen these potential challenges that emerge from political entrepreneurs in places like Poland, trying to exploit the anxiety and fear of many Polish farmers after communism fell, that with the end of communism, they're going to go through tremendous changes that were going to, overthrow their own interests in the pursuit of interests serving the new emerging economic and business classes in these countries, focused and concentrated in the cities, where, and of course, the communists always emphasized how they were modernizing Poland and modernizing Bulgaria, and that communism has never really had a great love for peasants, at least in Europe. I mean, going back to the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia in the 1917, the communists under Stalin and Lenin always claimed that their biggest enemies were the rich peasants, the kulaks. The kulaks. Kulak is a term that means, it technically means the fists. The fists, that the rich peasants were the main obstacle to revolutionary change in Russia, and Russia's backward and primitive compared to Western Europe because of the kulaks. And so, and targeting agricultural entrepreneurs. And so there's really been a disdain for peasants. And that was reflected in communism in Eastern Europe, particularly in some countries where, like Poland, which always has aspirations, as we covered in previous classes, to view itself as a genuine leader among European nation states, along with Germany, France, Italy, Spain, Britain, that Poland is a big, powerful country that is one of the great nations of Europe. And that means being modern, because when we think about Europe, we think about being prosperous and modern, industrialized and powerful, right? So even when I was studying Polish in the 1980s, that was a theme, that the communists desperately trying to get people to support the Polish United Workers' Party, the PZPR in Poland, would claim that they were making Poland into the 10th biggest industrial power in the world. I mean, I remember reading that in Polish communist propaganda, that we have transformed Poland into the 10th biggest economy, I think industrial economy in the world. Yay, see, we're modernizing Poland, and the peasants and their Catholic Church and their churches and their belief in Jesus Christ, that's all backward tradition. And then of course, communism collapsed in 1989, and still we see it's the people living in the cities that are supposed to be the ideals of being modern, are located in your big modern cities, that they are becoming the new business and political elites in the new post-communist, new capitalist world. And so there still is, and there's always been, and to this day, right, the biggest source of support for the Law and Justice Party in Poland are not only, but heavily concentrated in the countryside of Poland. Still, like I said, only 15% of the population are still making their living as farmers, but that's still a significant section of the Polish population. And in the countryside and in the small towns of Poland, that's where the main source of support for the Law and Justice Party is. And that means defending the Catholic Church. They're the ones that have made abortion illegal in Poland. Abortion is illegal in Poland. You think that's not surprising. Under communism, I remember reading when I was a student that it was cited that abortion was the most common form of birth control in communist Europe during the communist period in Europe. The most common form of control of birth control, of family planning, if you will, was abortion. I remember reading that the estimate was that your typical, I don't know, I think Russian woman, and if it was a Russian woman, it was probably East European in general. Typical Russian woman had 5 or 6 abortions in her life. 5 or 6 abortions, several abortions in the course of her life. So abortion was legal under communism, and anything that the church opposed, the communists favored. So yes, the communists, encouraged. I remember even in Bulgaria. I mean, I remember how it was strange when I was in Bulgaria from 2009 to 2000 from 1994 to 2009. That there was this. I mean, there was not even any kind of hesitation about premarital sex. Of course, you have premarital sex. Of course, women have access to birth control. I remember going to a Bulgarian pharmacy, and I was there trying to pick something up, and all these women came in, young women came in, and they were openly just buying their birth control pills, and there was no stigma, there was no shame, there was no. And I think that was a legacy of the Bulgarian communists. That the Bulgarian Communist Party really tried to portray itself as the modernizer of Bulgaria, and they hated the Bulgarian Orthodox Church, or at least they controlled it so that the Bulgarian Orthodox Church, which is a Christian church, that the Orthodox Church would become just a set of symbols for Bulgarian nationalism, but not a real powerful source of political opposition to the Communist Party of Bulgaria. And so the Bulgarian Communist Party manipulated historical symbols of the Bulgarian Orthodox Church because that's important for Bulgarian national identity. But they completely undermined the Bulgarian Orthodox Church. The people that run the Bulgarian Orthodox Church, they were all informers, informing to the Bulgarian secret police, serving the Communist Party. They were corrupt. They have the Bulgarian bishops had lots of money, expensive watches, nice big cars. So the point I'm trying to make is that there was a big potential for a backlash against any kinds of policies that seem to undermine the interests of the status quo agriculture in Poland and in these other countries, but particularly in Poland. And of course, there were outside actors that were encouraging this fear and anxiety in Poland regarding the looming changes that began 32 years ago with the fall of communism. So, for example, there was this person I remember reading about over 30 years ago, when I was in graduate school. His name was Andrzej Leper. Andrzej Leper was a Polish politician who began to exploit the fear and anxiety of Polish farmers going all the way back to the early 1990s, 30 years ago, against the radical economic changes that Poland was undergoing as part of its transition to capitalism and democracy. And he built an entire movement upon this fear and anxiety that Leszek Balcerowicz, who gets the credit for the economic reform program after communism, and that he was threatening to destroy the Polish farmers, and that Andrzej Leper would defend them. And this is, of course, the Poland would not join the European Union until 2004, and Andrzej Leper, he's got a funny last name. This is like a typical Polish sounding last name for a peasant sounding Polish name. It doesn't sound aristocratic. It sounds like, oh, this guy's a peasant. He's a Polish peasant. And there was always rumors that he was getting money from Russia, that the Russian government was subsidizing his movement. And he became quite popular at a point in Polish politics. And just to continue to highlight other news reports that we saw at the time, and it was a big shock. It was a big scandal when it found out that even though he was complaining against the European Union and warning against the danger of Poland joining the European Union, that Andrzej Leper was in fact receiving money from the Common Agricultural Policy of the European Union. And he died in 2011. He killed himself. He hung himself after after Poland joined the European Union, which was in 2004, and Polish farmers began getting the benefits of the Common Agricultural Policy. Lots and lots of Polish farmers went, "Oh wow, this European Union and its Common Agricultural Policy, this is great. We like this. Wow, we really like this Common Agricultural Policy. Yeah, yeah, yeah." And as a result, his political movement just disappeared. Once the Polish farmers became familiar with the European Union's Common Agricultural Policy, CAP. And he was charged with sexual assault, that he sexually assaulted his secretaries, and he just sort of disappeared. Yeah, it says here, but when Poland became a member of the European Union in 2004, he was among the first 5,000 farmers to receive farm subsidies from Brussels, the Common Agricultural Policy subsidies from Brussels. After his party won 11.5% of the vote in the 2005 parliamentary election, it won just 1.5% in 2007, and it pretty much disappeared. And then he killed himself. Bye-bye, Andrzej. And so, that's an example of the challenge that I think that covers it all here. Yeah, there you see a picture of him. So, I mentioned Andrzej Lepper's name at a conference, what was it, like early this year or a year ago, when there were some Polish participants on the Zoom international conference that we were having here, and I was on my computer. And, Polish people still speak about this guy because the Polish professor who was in the conference with me, a young woman, she knew who Andrzej Lepper was, and she's half my age. So people remember this guy, this Andrzej Lepper. But again, it just goes to show you how the Common Agricultural Policy undercut or weakened the political support for radical nationalist populists like him in Poland. And like I said, he killed himself because he was, Andrzej Lepper's share of the presidential vote crumbled to 1.28% in the 2010 election, after being one of the most prominent figures in Poland. So I mean, that's the point to take away from this discussion, right? That the Common Agricultural Policy is not just about economic efficiency; it's about political regulation and political stability, and co-opting groups within these societies to support European integration, and that's why, again, even under Donald Trump, you saw the previous president of the European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, refused to do away with the European Union's Common Agricultural Policy, despite the pressure of the Trump administration, and he just refused. He didn't even try to delay or just. And I think the reason is because it's a key to peace in Eastern Europe, where you have these large sections of society that have to transition away from agriculture, and you want them to feel that European Union is protecting their interests. And it's an inevitable process, right? As I mentioned, like what happened here in South Korea, that a South Korean family, they send their boy or girl from the village to the school in the city, and then they go to college and they end up staying at the city. They get a college degree. They stay in the city. They marry. They buy an apartment, and the grandparents or the parents stay in the village. And then on Chuseok, you go visit them. But pretty soon, your grandparents are going to pass, and you're going to end up selling that village, that house, or you're going to keep it as your own vacation house. But you're not going to be engaged in farming. You'll probably sell the land or lease the land to some big agricultural company that will farm the land for you, but you're not going to be involved in any farming. I mean, it's such a bad issue, right? It's such a difficult situation in South Korea that South Korea has to try to find wives for South Korean men farmers in South Korean villages, because South Korean farmer men are having difficulty finding wives. So the South Korean government has opened up immigration to women from Malaysia and Vietnam who agree to marry South Korean men in the village because they can't find South Korean women as wives because they all go to the city, right? So so just to, that's this process that's underway there. So I should try to give you some participation credit. So let me go to the Cyber Campus site and let me see what I've got set up for participation credit. And so you can see what I'm doing here, vote. So, oh, let's see. I don't know if I have anything really set up to do here without spending some time on setting it up, but what's this? Okay, so let me look at the exercises that I have set up here. Well, I guess I only have this one set up. So again, you see now that that the European Union is no longer including Great Britain, the United Kingdom, and the European Union, that there's more and more conflict involving the European Union and the United Kingdom, so you see here they're having difficulty resolving all of these disputes in terms of access to fishing rights and fishing ports in the English Channel between France and Great Britain, and you see that Boris Johnson, in the middle of this economic pandemic and the difficult economic conditions of recovering from the pandemic, seems to be exploiting the continuing conflict between the United Kingdom and the European Union to try to rally support for his government by highlighting the conflict and emphasizing pride in being British against the supposed threat to United Kingdom sovereignty from the European Union, in particular regarding the fishing rights with French fishermen and British fishermen in the English Channel, and I already mentioned the Northern Ireland issue, and I wanted to just highlight that in terms of the framework that I reintroduced at the last class, right? That this framework, which I showed you in the last class, we talked about on the high level degree the control system in place in between governments. So we talked about normative habitual control, coercion, utilitarian, normative active control. When in the case, for example, of a typical developed society, when one of these elements decreases in significance because of, say, a disruption of the COVID-19 pandemic, in addition to the Brexit of the United Kingdom from the European Union, if one of these goes down in salience, one of these other elements must increase in salience in order to compensate, or else there will be a removal of the ruling elite if they're not able to compensate. So as Britain's economic situation continues to be disrupted due to Brexit and the COVID-19 pandemic, with the disruptions to the British economy that are occurring due to the COVID-19 pandemic, you see Boris Johnson's continue to rely upon appeals to British patriotism, normative active control, to compensate for this. And that means appealing to British patriotism against a supposed threat. And that threat, is the European Union. And so expect to see this to be an ongoing source of tension between United Kingdom and European Union for a number of reasons, but including the fact that the ruling party in Great Britain is going to continue to appeal to the supposed alleged threat from the European Union to rally support for his party as utilitarian economic factors continue to decline in Britain because of the disruptions of the pandemic and the Brexit from the European Union. And of course, Boris Johnson is all blaming this on the pandemic, or then he says it's because of Britain is transitioning to become a more prosperous economy in the future through breaking its ties. But we already covered, for example, about how the British are having difficulty finding truck drivers to supply their stores. So they can't find enough truck drivers to drive trucks to bring gasoline, petrol to British gas stations, and there are shortages in British markets and stores because they don't have truck drivers, because so many truck drivers came over from Poland and the European Union to drive trucks as work, hard work that paid decently that British people don't want to do. And now that Britain's out of the European Union, they went back home to the European Union. And so Boris Johnson is desperately continually trying to play with British patriotism. So that was the context for this question I was going to ask you. Do you think the United States, in order to protect the stability between its allies, Britain and France, United States, dealing with China and Russia, that the United States and we'll try to come up with a free trade agreement with the European Union and Great Britain in order to make sure there's continuing alliance with the United States in containment of Russia and China. That we're going to see the United States move to an FTA with Britain and the European Union in order to stabilize relations between Britain and France and the rest of the European countries to focus on Russia and China. So please vote. You have 15 seconds. Please vote. I think you can see that, right? And vote. And so you can see the results. So I have to go now because we are now going back to classrooms. So I have to go to K260 for the American history class. So I'm going to have to stop this class. And so I can pick up my things and get set up in K260. So bye.